A lot of us in the general public, we only see certain polls, many of which, to be fair, really aren't very good. Now, I'm going against a little bit our last week's guest, who I know you gave him a really nice comment. You gave him really nice what do you call it, testimony for his book, Carl Allen, we had on last week.
Yeah.
But and he would tell you too that some polls are better than others. Like Ann Selzer does really good work in Iowa. You don't want to put her in the same bucket as Trafalgar or somebody like that.
Yeah.
But I've heard you say that there's some internal polling the campaigns are doing that we're not privy to. Do you have access to any of those internal polls? And are you seeing anything different than what we've seen from a lot of the good polls, Times, Siena, Marquette, Emerson, any of the others?
Well, you have to understand, and I think Carl understands this too. And I'm a big proponent of the book. I have read it. It's accessible, it's informative, and if you are into polling, it is a good read. But you have to understand something, like the difference between a Nate Silver and a Nate Cohn, and a lot of these data science nerds that I love and I follow on Twitter that are just kind of going over these the Economist polling, and they kind of get into these fights about these obscure elements of the polls. No campaign manager is looking at these guys and listening to these guys and saying, oh, that's the way you run a campaign. And I like to say these are the guys that can tell you everything you need to know about a woman, but have never dated one before, right? And I don't mean that in a bad way. Like I said, I love what they're doing, and I'm very interested in it. But they're not campaign professionals. I'm not saying they haven't polled for campaigns. A handful of them have. The vast majority of them have not. And that's not the way we use polls as an instrument. We don't look at the public polls and go, oh, here's what this is saying, or here's what that is saying. You create and craft a polling instrument for the purposes of what you're trying to garner the information for. And most of what pollsters, internal polls are being used for right now is movement. That's what you're looking for. And at this point in the cycle, what they're doing is what's called tracking polls, which is you run about, let's just use hypothetical numbers. If you're getting a full sample of 1,000, you interview 300 on one day, 300 on the next day, another 300, and every day you run 300, and those give you a sign of the actual move of public opinion.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's the way you do it in the waning days of a campaign, usually the last 5 or 6 weeks, because what you're seeing is what ads are working, what message is working, what is not working, with what groups that help you get to victory. So the way we consume them in the public is like, oh, let's throw them into this average. And here's Monmouth, and here's Marist, and here's Quinnipiac, and here's the New York Times Siena. And then if people don't like it, they're like, oh, this subgroup was too small, and this doesn't really answer this, and they didn't do the methodology, and they overweighted for Republicans, so it's garbage. And then if it agrees with them next month, they're like, oh, see, we're way up.
You're right.
And there's tons of people, I don't want to name any names, but there's a lot of media figures that aren't campaign professionals that just do this. They just create cheerleading for their side using these polls, when that's not what polls are designed to do, as Carl will tell you, right? And so campaign professionals don't look at that way. We use, right now, you're in the tracking phase. And let me give you a specific example. It tells you why, for example, do you remember when they were attacking Tim Walz for like his military service?
Yeah. Yeah, what did they had a term for that? I forgot what it was off the top of my head.
Yeah,
stolen valor.
Yeah, stolen valor. Yeah, you don't even remember it anymore. And you know why? Because the polling was showing it doesn't work.
It's not working.
Sticking. Yeah. So they stop and they move to something else. The reason why Kamala Harris is going to the border is because she's got a problem. She wouldn't be doing that unless the tracking was showing that. They're not running one poll, although they might be on top of the track to get a specific issue set, to get an understanding of the horse race at this point. But mostly what they're doing is they're following the daily track. Okay. And they're literally, what you do is you do 300 on Monday, 300 on Tuesday, 300 on Wednesday. By the time you get to 300 on Thursday, you throw out the first 300.
Okay.
Does that
Now,
make
is that
sense?
based on what the campaign is doing? So the 300, 300, 300 on successive days. Let's
Mhm.
say the middle day is when she goes to the border. Are
Mhm.
you looking at the next day's 300 after
Yeah,
she goes to the border to see if there's any movement there, or does it
yeah,
not work that quickly?
it does. Well, I mean, you can see it that quickly as a data point,
Yeah,
but what you're trying to do is get a sense of where public opinion is moving,
right.
and you can see emergent issues. So, like for example, and again, for somebody who's sophisticated, who's looking at this, and you heard like 2 weeks ago, you started to hear like Unidos US and like Latino organizations who use the same pollster as Harris,
Uh-huh.
these Latino pollsters that oversample Spanish language, started to say, oh, look, Trump is now down in the low 30s. And they were the only ones saying that. Everybody else is coming in, and Trump is in the mid high 40s, high 30s.
Yeah.
And only Biden, only Harris and Biden's pollster was saying she's doing better. She's doing better. That's a sign to me. Like they're flooding the zone, trying to run a narrative that is not true.
Okay.
Nobody else is seeing that. It's the same shenanigans that the same pollsters were doing in 2020 and in 2016. And I called them on it, and they were wrong, and I was right, and it's happening again. Is they're trying to say that their candidate is doing better than she is. And the reason why I know I'm right is because she's showing up and going to the border in Arizona.
Right.
They know that there's a problem, and Trump is at a higher range than he was at even in 2020, which was a very high historic range for a Republican. Now, is it in the 40s? Probably not. But if he's at 37, 38, that explains why Arizona is moving away, as the New York Times Sienna's poll showed. And everyone's like, oh, it's an outlier. It's not true. And I'm not saying the 45-50 number or whatever it was is accurate. What I'm saying is look at the movement. If you're trying to say the 45 is accurate compared to 47, you're missing the whole point. If
Yeah.
you're seeing the numbers move away, that's what you're looking for.
So I was going to ask you a related question. So when I hear you talk about the 35%, right? Um, so
Yeah.
to
And that's
just
a
to
very loose number. I just give that to people because they need something to sleep at night.
right, right. So it's like
35%, you mean that's the number that we got to keep Trump under with Hispanic voters to be in a competitive position to win?
thank you. That was a
Yeah.
context, but you filled it in better than I could. My question though is you're specifically focused on keeping Trump at 35 or below, and preferably in the high 20s. You don't talk so much about the Harris's support or her support numbers. What?
Doesn't
So
matter.
tell me why tell
Yeah.
me why that is.
In fact, I'm really not watching her numbers at all
Right. So
on
I don't
any of them.
is
On
that a
any of
math
them.
issue? Like I don't understand
Yeah,
why the focus
mainly.
is
Look, the reason why is Trump has a very hard ceiling with most demographics. He's really never broken over 47% of the vote, right,
right.
nationally. And he is starting to gather some strength with non-college educated white women, which, by the way, he overperformed with in 16 and in 20 based off of the uh early to mid late polling.
Yeah.
White college educated women were behaving more Democrat than they actually showed up and voted. He's also overperforming with kind of working class voters. Those numbers are creeping up for him right now. And he's doing better with Hispanics, quantifiably. I'm
Mhm.
not following the black vote that much because it's really not going to be determinative in any place except for North Carolina, which is important.
Yeah.
But I think that will fall into a historical range. I also think that Kamala Harris, being a black woman, will probably bring those numbers back into a historical range. So we're probably fighting about 2 or 3 percentage points. And the other funny thing about this, Corey, is, and it's so odd to me, but it says so much about the way we understand race and ethnicity in this country. There are more Latino voters than there are black voters in more swing key states than there are black voters, but we're obsessed with this black white paradigm in this country. So we don't know how to talk about race any other way.
Mm.
But, black voters will be important in Wisconsin, but there's more Latino voters in Wisconsin than there are blacks. There are more black voters than there are Latinos in North Carolina. But, the margins in Pennsylvania are going to be very similar. Arizona is Latino. Nevada is Latino. Georgia, obviously, a huge black population. But my point is, there are more Latino voters now than there are black voters. That's, to me, if we want to talk about a racial realignment or racial positioning, Latino voters have moved dramatically more to the Republican side than black voters have. But we're not talking about it that way because most of the people driving the narrative are white people, and that's the way they see race, especially on the East Coast.
So
So I don't think that was really answering your question, but I got off on a little bit of a tangent
that's
there.
all right. So you ended up taking it where I was curious about. The other thing I've heard you talk about is that Trump's success with Hispanic Latino voters is kind of not not only not by design, it's almost like an irony that he's increasing his support from
Yeah,
Latino voters.
yeah.
So it's like a broken clock is right twice a day kind of a thing, or
Yeah, it really is. And I'll tell you why. What Donald Trump is trying to do, what he's always tried to do, what he innately tries to do, the way he's constituted, is to overperform with non-college educated white people, the white working man, the forgotten man. And so in 16, he shocks the world by overperforming, and wins, pulls an inside straight, and wins the Electoral College by an overperformance of those voters. He's never moved off of that demographic ever. He's
right?
leaned harder and harder into it, even though it's shrinking. But who's replacing them are third generation Latino voters who don't view themselves that differently from this white non-college educated voter.
Yeah.
And they frankly, they look very similar, they behave very similar, they socialize similarly, they consume the same media, they're watching, listening to Joe Rogan podcast, they're English dominant or English exclusive. They 2/3 of them identify primarily as American first, and then their ethnic heritage, in the distant past. And so, Trump, to his credit, they renamed their Latino outreach program Latino Americans for Trump, which is speaking directly to this demographic. And by the way, this is not a small marginal group. This is the place where most of the Latino voter growth is exploding. So it's brilliant, it's genius. And I'm not saying that they did it because they're brilliant. I'm just saying that in many ways they've been proven right, but for the wrong reasons. In
Yeah.
fact, this is something I posted on my Substack last night.
Oh yeah,
Was
the
the
2012
2012
post-election.
autopsy
Yeah.
shows that, yeah, the Republican Party was saying we need to diversify the party. And then there was all this hand wringing because they were like, we need to diversify the party. And then they nominate Trump. And everyone's like, oh my God, well, forget about that. He overthrew the establishment. Nobody believes that anymore. But then look at the party. The party is actually more diverse. It's just not diverse for the reasons that the Republican establishment in 2012 was articulating. I
Right.
mean, it's fascinating. Nobody but Mike Madrid talks about these things, but the Republican Party is more diverse under Donald Trump than it has been at any time since the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
So some
And,
of what we're
it's becoming more diverse under Donald Trump.
most of what we're talking about is within the urgency of the moment, within the urgency of the fact that a national election is already being
Yeah.
conducted,
Yeah.
and that whatever it is, whatever that the first Tuesday in November is, November 5th, I think it is this year. So it's that urgency, but over time, I I'm bullish and bearish all at the same time. I'm short-term bearish now all
Mhm.
of a sudden, but long-term bullish. Long-term bullish because what we were talking about before, that if Kamala Harris can help change the fundamental direction of messaging and policy making of the Democratic coalition, long-term, that's a good thing because like if we're just talking about North Carolina alone, forgive me, I don't remember the exact numbers, but there's hundreds of thousands of new voters that are Latino in
Yeah.
North Carolina,
Yeah.
either from people who just moved to the state or from people who just turned 18 and are new voters because they
Correct.
just turned 18. So
Correct.
long term, I have reason to be bullish, but short term, I have reason to be bearish because it seems like the messaging isn't quite getting through in time.
That's it. Is it too little, too late? That's why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
That's why I wrote, the New York Times op-ed. That's why I've been tweeting it every day. There are people in the White House in the campaign who I've been in, informal communication with. I'm not a paid operative from the White House, and they've never asked and I've never offered, because the best thing I can do right now is continually drive the narrative with the press and the media and explain the math to them to say, you're looking at this race wrong.
Mm,
And what Kamala Harris is doing is exactly the right thing. The question is, can she fix in 50 days the bad advice that the Democrats have gotten for the past 10 years?
yeah.
It's going to be tough, but she's doing it. She's leaning into it. The Democrats can never go back after this. They can't just be like, oh, if Kamala loses, well, we were wrong. Let's go, more to the left on border security. Like that's not, those days are gone.
Right.
30 years of political identity in the Latino community is gone. And along with it, the consultants who were saying that was the right thing to do, and the advocacy organizations are going to have to pivot to survive, to start talking about things that are more relevant to the Latino community, because they have been quantifiably wrong for a decade. And I've been saying it. And look, by the way, they didn't just start losing Latino voters in 2020. They lost Latino voters in 2016. They've been losing them since 2012. This decade slide has been going on for a decade. Like, wake the hell up.
Yeah.
And they have, but the question is, she's not at where Biden was. I think she's going to get there. I think she can get there. I think she can push Trump into the mid-low 30s, but at the moment, that rolling track that we're talking about is actually, I think, going higher for Trump. I think he is hitting high 30s now, maybe touching 40. MSNBC's rolling average, Steve Kornacki has, his rolling average at 41% with Latinos.
Ooh, man.
So it's not,
it's not moving in the right direction.
No. But like I said, and then there's this other qualifier, and I hate to do this to your poor listeners, but the Latino and Nevada voter, and those Latinos are not like the North Carolina or Pennsylvania voter. In fact, I wrote some analysis on the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation poll, came out 2 days ago, that showed Trump at 43% with Texas Hispanics. I believe that. I think that's true. Is that controvertible to North Carolina Hispanics? No, it's not.
It's a different population, though, right?
It's different generationally. They're much more recently migrated, and the more recently migrated you are, the more Democratic leaning you are by a considerable amount. And so the Democrats have this sort of peculiar vested interest in defining Latinos as this recently migrated Spanish-speaking immigrant worker. That's not a sizable share of the Latino electorate anymore, if it ever was, and it's shrinking fast. So that voter that they keep communicating to, the name of her outreach campaign is Latinos con Harris. It's Spanish. Less than 20% of our voters are getting their political news and information in Spanish, and it's shrinking.
Yeah.
So like I was saying, Trump, and I'm not saying it's because they're smart, but they're leaning into the demographic movement. Harris is pushing against it. There's been a lot of Democratic consultants who've, kind of criticized me publicly on Twitter the other day, which is great, because at least they're
what's his name again? That was a great conversation, by the way.
Carlos Odio. And I'm a big fan of Carlos's. I see things very differently, and I think I'm being proven right. I think I was proven right in 2022 and right in 2020. Like, the best track record of who is right. He could be right this year. I could be wrong. I think we're probably saying mostly the same thing, because we generally do. I think that you're probably going to see Trump in the 35 to 37 range. That's higher than I would like. That makes Arizona really, really nail-bitingly thin. That makes Nevada really nail-bitingly thin. I think it is easier to win North Carolina than it is to win Arizona this year. I didn't say that in 2020.
Right.
I was the first guy bullish on Arizona. I was the first guy out there saying it. And I was probably one of the first saying it on North Carolina 3 years ago.
Are there
for demographic reasons?
Okay, so demographic reasons. Are there certain constituencies where the Harris campaign can gain ground, or maybe some constituencies where she can shave some points off of Trump's advantage?
She can get some of these Latino voters back, and I think that she will. And the way they're doing it is leaning into this messaging that I'm talking about. She is doing the right things, but like I said, she's got to convince these voters that she's a Reagan Republican. Right? Literally. Like, we used to call them Reagan when I was a kid. When I was a kid, we called them Reagan Democrats.
Yeah. Because the people who were voting for Kennedy in 1960 are voting for Reagan in 80 and 84.
Yeah. And the Reagan Democrat was a white, blue collar, non-college educated, lunch bucket, construction hat wearing dude.
Yeah.
Who's like, go to church on Sundays, play by the rules, never going to be a millionaire. But if I could get a mortgage and save up a little bit for vacation and send my kids to college, and their life will be better than mine.
Yeah.
That's the Latino voter right now. That's the working class. And the Democrats have gotten so far away from them because they're talking about these issues where they don't align. And the irony of it, I think to most people, it's commonsensical. To me, you read the book. It's like, if you think that those people view the world through the immigrant experience, all you're saying is you don't understand them. And frankly, what we've been seeing in focus groups and polls later and anecdotally is it's become offensive.
Yeah.
Like respect me a little bit. Like
Right.
I'm trying to make rent here. I'm
Yeah.
playing by the rules. I'm working my ass off. I'm doing everything right. And you keep telling me about kids in cages and building a wall. I'm worried about an opportunity economy issue. So I'm saying she's made the pivot. She's doing the right things. The question is, can she break through that brand that Democrats have not only allowed themselves to be defined by, but leaned into?
Yeah.
Because they were advised this is what Latinos think, and they were quantifiably wrong.
Yeah, so some of the policies that I'm hearing are very encouraging as a small business owner.
Yeah.
$50,000 tax
Yes.
benefits to first time business startups.
That's camp, dude. That is tax cuts for
Yeah,
ownership. Like that, you
yeah,
don't get more Republican in the 80s than that. Like that's,
yeah.
and it's coming from Kamala Harris and the Democrats.
So
Like I want to say this one more time. I know I'm beating a dead horse, but there's some
no,
validation in all of this. All of these issues, 8 out of 10 of these issues it's Reagan Republicanism. It's classic conservatism is what Kamala Harris is running on
yeah,
because that's where the center is at.
it's Alex P. Keaton conservatism.
It is. It truly is.
So one of the things that we haven't talked a ton about is what I referred to before. When I was on Wall Street, some of the guys were strict technical analysts, where they would do, I think it's called Fibonacci calculations,
Mm-hmm.
to find where the it was all based on the price of the stock, finding the history of the price of the stock, and that was it. And they could
That's
figure
it.
out where it was going from there.
It's
But
plateauing. There's the buy opportunity and buy on the dip and da 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 and
yeah,
watch the trend
resistance
line.
level, support
Yeah,
levels, yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I think a lot of folks are looking at this election through a strictly technical analysis
Mm-hmm.
lens,
Mm-hmm.
but I also see some what we would think of as fundamental analysis or qualitative
Yep.
facts on the ground. So what I'm talking about in this election is fundraising, party organizing, volunteer signups, or I mean, a lot of folks want to say it's a vibe or enthusiasm election, but I'm not ready to dismiss that. Is that fair to say? Am I on the right track? And if not, like, what are you seeing, and how do you see the fundamentals impacting this race, if at all?
I've always believed that the fundamentals benefit a Democrat in this race and an incumbent. This is why I was saying Biden shouldn't be replaced as an incumbent Democrat, um, who is known, even with his weaknesses, he was known. You introduce a variable that is unknown, and you are taking more downside risk than upside. Now, most people would say,
Okay.
Mike, you are just completely wrong about this, and that's fine. We're never going to know the answer to this. But what I will say is I have very, very rarely ever seen what I am seeing now, which is a candidate with so much unknown,
Hmm.
see her approval ratings going up.
Yeah.
That's important.
Right.
But why is she also shrinking with working class voters, white, non-college educated women and Hispanic voters, and still holding a higher number? And keep in mind, Hillary Clinton had higher favorables than Donald Trump in 2016 and lost. So remember, the polling is only so good because when we're looking at a national picture, it's not telling that electoral college battleground state story.
Hmm.
And what I really hate is guys who come and go like, well, here's a 7-state story. And we polled just the battleground states. That is complete horseshit. Sorry about the language. I know it's a family show.
No, no, no. We get the explicit rating, man.
Anybody selling that stuff, dismiss them,
Okay.
ignore them. You can sell me a state by state poll, but don't give me this 7 battleground things. Like, are you weighting Pennsylvania Puerto Ricans equally with Arizona Mexicans by generational splits? Like, that is just dumb. It's
Yeah.
just dumb. Is it giving you some sense? I guess, but it's probably confusing the issue more than anything else. So let's take polling out of it, though. There are some other fundamentals that you look at. Registration surges, which have never quantifiably been correlates to outcomes or
Okay.
voting behavior. You're hearing this a lot from guys like Tom Bonnier, and I'm a fan of Tom Bonnier, or the Taylor Swift effect or the Dobbs effect, right? Like, yeah, there have been significant spikes. But one of my favorites is look at Latina percentage rates have gone up 200%. You never hear the raw numbers, by the way. You go up 200%. Well, going from 20 to 60 voters is 200%.
Right.
What does that mean in terms of raw numbers? But more importantly than that, what is the natural demographic change? Because there's far more Latinas eligible to be registered to vote in 2020 than there were in in 2024 than there were in 2020.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So those analyses they're not telling the full story. A lot of this stuff is just people who know enough about data to kind of get likes on their social media page and get people engaged and give them that hopium, as it's called, right? That false or real hope. It's hope about, like, what are the good signs? Like, I'm going to show you the good spin on everything because everything is great. And I think it's because I've actually done campaigns, and not even just as a vendor, like I've overseen the whole operations, where I'm like, that's not the way you look at a race. At least that's not the way a political professional looks at it. I get the fans, I get the average voter, people who just need to be able to go to sleep at night, need what they need. There's a role for all of this, but 99% of what you're seeing on cable shows are not from people who have been the number ones on a campaign and run stuff. They may come in and do polls. They may come in and do focus groups. They may come in and do these small segments of a campaign, but they've never been able to put the whole thing in context.
Right.
It's just, they're selling sexy stuff that gets people's eyes focused and fixated on it. And so nothing is that clean. Enthusiasm is a factor, and I believe it's an important factor because the enthusiasm between Democrats and Republicans is sizable and it's significant this year. Is it going to be determinative? Hell, I don't know. Approval rating, it does matter. How much? Hell, I don't know. These registration surges, they're important. They are a data point. How do you weight that compared to everything else? I don't know. But those to me are fundamental dynamics that do show strength, at least in the base, in the Democratic base, that we have not seen on the Republican side since Harris became the nominee. Because the other part for registrations, for example, Republicans since the midterms have been dramatically out registering voters.
Republicans have been out registering.
Yeah,
Okay.
by huge numbers. So when we see these like surges, it's like, oh, those Democrats are surging right now. It's like, yeah, in the last 3 weeks. But look at the last 2 years. Look at this last midterm. It's there's way more Republican registrations. Like I said, so a lot of this data, there's lies, damn lies, and then there's statistics, right? a lot of these guys they don't really run races. They just know enough to keep the narrative going in a certain direction, and they get on cable and they've got a gazillion likes and they're got these followings. And like I said, if you need that, go for it. But that's not the way campaign pros look at races.
Yeah, no,
there's no campaign professional at a high level in a race going, look at the voter registration surge. That's the sign that's gonna put us over. Like, I guarantee you that's not happening.
What about dozens of campaign offices around Pennsylvania versus, a small handful for the Trump campaign?
It doesn't matter. Yes, on the extreme margin. So a huge ground game, maybe it can be quantified to benefit you 1.5%.
Which can win the race in most of these swing states.
It can, which is why that is an advantage.
Yeah.
But here's the other problem. Now, here's a counterpoint to that. Republicans are winning high turnout races because the coalitions are changing. Non-college educated, low information voters are breaking towards Trump. So the higher turnout, the better it is for the Republicans. Look at 2020. It was the highest turnout election in American history. And Republicans picked up seats in the House.
Right.
Trump lost because the same dynamic that was bringing these low propensity voters to the polls was turning off college educated voters. So he screwed himself. But never in history, at least in living memory since the 1940s or 50s, have we seen a historically high, the highest turnout, election in history benefit the Republicans. Like, that's completely contrarian. But when you understand that the bases of the party have changed under Trump, it makes perfect sense. So when low turnout elections, special elections like Tom Suozzi against during the George Santos seat in Long Island, they're benefiting the Democrats.
The Democrats. Why?
Because Democrats are more college educated, high informed, highly engaged voters. They show up and vote. They've got higher propensities. And when I was a kid in the 80s, it was always Democrats were low information, voters of color, working class, non-college educated. They'd come out in presidential elections, but you could never get them out for a special or midterms. That has changed. That has changed, or is changing. And as it's changing, like I talked to my buddy Chuck Rocha, who's an organizer that's focused on turnout for years. like, you better be careful, man. You think you're going to go into these Latino communities and turn out as many Latinos as you can. You're turning out a lot of Trump voters.
So I'm glad you mentioned Chuck on the last. I think it was the latest episode of Latino Vote, another great podcast. If you can't get enough Mike Madrid,
I know. There's always
you know,
more Mike Madrid
there's
somewhere.
always more Mike Madrid, but it's a really great. And I love your rapport with Chuck. I was really heartened to hear my own home district mentioned a couple times in the last one,
Yeah.
California 27.
Yeah.
Now, a couple days ago, and I think you retweeted this, polls came out about specific House races.
Mhm.
Ours had George Whitesides, the Democratic candidate, Republican incumbent Mike Garcia polling both in the mid 40s.
Mhm.
Whiteside slightly ahead. My quick take on it, especially just having read Carl's book, is that with numbers in the mid 40s, there's still so much wiggle room
Mm.
left in the race. It could really break either way. And the other thing too, though, is three with a special election and two general elections. Garcia shows a lot of resilience in a district that voted for Biden
Yeah.
by I think 10 points. So where do you see, just selfishly, where do you see California 27 at this point?
I've always thought the problem with California 27 is you just have bad candidates. And no offense to
Mm,
Christy Smith, but bad candidate.
yeah,
Just quantifiably, like that explains a lot of it.
yeah,
And in these small races, those things do matter. I don't think this guy Whiteside or whatever, a rich old white dude is, I mean, when I was a kid, when you said rich old white guy, that was a Republican.
yeah.
Now it's the progressive in the race.
Man, if the
And now,
Democrats had the equivalent of Suzette Valladares, I'm pretty excited about her campaign. If there is a reinvigoration of the Republican Party,
yeah.
maybe I'm just because I become
Well,
enamored with.
Mike Garcia.
Yeah,
I mean, he's a partisan, but his profile is frankly better. He's a veteran.
yeah,
So yeah, look at the Valladares and Garcia are the perfect example of candidates that Democrats should be finding. They're not. They're
mm,
running old white dudes, and they're wondering why they're losing on the margins. That's why. I mean, Garcia, if you do the regression analysis in your district and you're able to parse out Latino surnames, Garcia's winning about 50% of the Hispanic vote. It's an upwardly mobile, second, third generation college educated voter straight out of my book. I grew up in your parts. I know
yeah,
that voter. Mike
yeah,
Garcia is one of those voters. Like, he's that dude.
right.
He speaks Spanish, but he's a second generation guy. Went to military academy. He's a pilot. He lives in nice burbs outside of the urban core. That's a Republican voter.
Yeah, second, third
Second,
generation.
third
Yeah,
generation. And
yeah.
and that's what the Democrats are having trouble finding. Look at John Duarte up here in my parts. Adam Gray. Adam Gray is the nominee in a district that is like 40% Latino. And the Democrats can't find a Latino candidate? Like, even if Adam Gray wins, and he might, I think he's a much tougher fight than people think he is. But if Adam Gray wins, the chances of the Republicans running a Latino against him in 2 years is like 100,000%. And we'll probably beat him.
So I'm
So,
hearing,
like,
correct me
it,
if I'm wrong, but I'm hearing you say that you're more bearish than a lot of others that the Democrats can flip the House.
no, the Democrats are going to win the House.
Oh, okay. So what seats are you looking at that is going to turn the?
Will Rollins will
Yeah,
beat
yeah.
Kevin Calvert. Okay,
He's
I think his is the most likely to flip out of all the seats, and no one's really looking at that one. Everyone's like at that one as 7.
I get it. I get 3 emails a day from Will Rollins'
Yeah,
campaign.
a great candidate, perfect fit for the district. Calvert's like this old dated guy with all his issues. I think Rollins wins. If you
Okay.
got money, throw some at the guy. I'm not involved with them. I mean, I know him. I met him. I'm really interested in that race. I think Michelle Steele wins. I think Young Kim wins. The Republicans there
In Orange County, yeah.
in Orange County. Or I'm doing a lot of work in Orange County looking at this because you have a lot of non-white college educated voters,
Yeah.
which is kind of what you've got with Mike Garcia and Valadez. Like, that's the future of American politics, and they're breaking more Republican. So, I think one of the stories that will come out, and working with a reporter there, and again, this is off topic, but this is why California does remain an interesting place, is you could have 3 of the most contested congressional districts in the country represented by Asian Americans in
Oh,
Orange
that's
County.
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And a lot of it is correlate to educational attainment. Is you've got Asian Americans who are the non-white constituency with the highest levels of college attendance and graduation rates, as opposed to Latinos who should, by raw numbers,
Hmm.
be they're bigger segments of the electorate there. Anyway, but bottom line is, I do believe that the Democrats will pick up the House. I don't know that it will be huge because I think Republicans are going to do better down ticket than people think they're going to.
Mm,
But you know, the House is incredibly important because it's the new House that certifies the election. Um,
right. That's
and
so important.
if Trump wins, the real buffer to protect us is the House, and it will be by a very small margin.
Senate's probably going 1 or 2 seats, small Republican majority, you think?
Small Republican majority.
Yeah. So the House, you think there a couple of those New York seats are going to be more fruitful than
More
most of the
Democratic.
California seats. Yeah, for Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Democrats should have had a better candidate than Gray in that seat. He can win. I think that Valadeo wins. I think Garcia probably wins. Wrong candidate profile. Sure, he's a fine fella. Sorry, I don't mean to make any enemies here. And I think Young Kim wins. I think Michelle Steele wins. I think the David Min versus Scott Baugh race becomes very important. I think Baugh is pulling ahead right now, but there's a lot of college-educated voters, Republicans, who are probably going to not vote for Trump, but will vote down ticket as a check, the way they did in 2016.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then Will Rollins race becomes really, really important. So you could see, I think, two, let's say, sorry to nerd out like this with your people listening, but let's say Gray beats Duarte, and let's say Baugh picks up the Porter seat. That's a
Democrat,
yeah,
democratically held right now.
yeah, and all the other incumbents win, which I think is very likely. Then Rollins' seat becomes really important for one seat Democratic pickup.
Yeah. Um, okay, so man, we could nerd out quite a bit here, but going back to the top of the ticket, you alluded to something earlier, and your take on it is very different than where most analysts would say, and that is you believe that Biden would be closing out stronger than where you see Harris closing out at this point.
I wouldn't put it that way. What I would say is they're going to end up in largely the same place,
Okay.
but Biden's weaknesses were baked in and Harris's are not. So again, you have to look at this and say, okay, Mike, that's true. Harris's approval ratings are going up, but she's in a weaker spot than Clinton and Biden were at this point in the race.
I think there's such different races, though. I don't.
Every race is different.
It's
Every race
it
is different.
it's not apples to apple. I see this race is so different. Um, yeah, I mean to compare.
This is going to be a remarkably close race that's going to be very similar to what 2020 was.
Okay.
Okay. So because we are so negatively partisanized. And in that environment, I would never introduce variables that are unknown. There are so few things that you can control in a campaign environment that what you can control, you desperately to the death control them.
I see what you're saying. So I'm probably looking at way too simplistically, but you see both candidates, at least in this race, as having a pretty well-defined ceiling. You talked about Trump's as being around 47. Trump also has a pretty hard floor. Whereas
Correct.
once you introduce Harris into the equation, the floor, we don't know where the floor is, but it's
Correct.
lower than Biden's was.
Correct. She may
Okay.
have a higher ceiling, she may have a higher floor, but what I'm saying is you don't need to take that gamble when the other fundamentals are in your favor.
Hmm.
People, like I said, this Biden to Trump voter does not exist. It didn't in the midterms when things were significantly worse. When people had much higher concerns about the economy, his age was already still a problem. All of these problems Biden has, but the fundamentals were worse in 2022, and the Democrats did really well. So, like, why would you roll the dice? And I like I said, it may work out perfectly. She may win 350 electoral votes, and
Yeah,
then people are like, Mike, you're absolutely a fool. The truth of the matter is, I think if Harris wins, I think Biden would have won anyway.
that's interesting.
And then I think if Harris loses, I think there's probably a better chance that Biden would have won.
So I have little pieces of evidence where why I disagree. I'm not a campaign professional or a former campaign professional. It's just the little bits of evidence that I can gather from my own experiences, as well as what I'm learning, from talking to guys like you and a lot of other folks from doing this program for 4 years now. And I'll tell you one, and this is not scientific at all.
Let me
I
say
have,
this. Let me say
yeah,
this first.
sure.
Vibes are not fundamentals.
No, no,
But,
no, not
but go ahead.
vibes. But
Okay.
it's the equivalent. And then I know you're going to disagree with this, but
Yeah.
because you talked about what is it called when you get a bunch of people in a room and you ask them a bunch of questions? It's case in
Focus
that
group.
case focus groups. Okay,
Mhm.
so I was in a de facto focus group. I happened to be there 2 days after the June debate, and it was college educated suburban women in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Did we talk? I don't know if we ever
Mm-mm.
talked about this.
No.
So it was about a dozen of my friends that fit that profile to the T.
Hmm.
I'm guessing that at least 8 or 9 of them voted for Biden in 2020.
Hmm.
Maybe 3 or 4 of them didn't vote at all. Maybe 1 or 2 ended up voting for Trump in 2016 and 2020. So 2 days after that, let's see, the debate was on a Thursday. No, I was there on a Sunday. Nice dinner. I used to work with these folks in the New Hope theater scene, the Bucks County theater scene.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm telling you, not a single person. There might have been one person that was still enthusiastic and say, I like kind of like me. I'll vote for a can of beans over,
Hmm.
Donald Trump.
Hmm.
But nobody was enthusiastic or terribly excited about it.
Right.
And then I stay in touch with them, email and Facebook and stuff like that. Get to that Saturday where there's the assassination attempt, and a couple of those ladies were, he's looking pretty strong. They were much more strongly leaning towards voting for Trump at that point.
Hmm.
It's turned around 180 degrees.
Hmm.
Not right away when Biden dropped out and he supported Harris, but over time, these different benchmarks. When she picked Walls,
Those
the
those are not
Democratic convention
benchmarks. Oh, you mean the benchmarks of the campaign?
of the campaign of the
Yeah.
campaign.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I check in. Where are you at? And it's like 180 degrees. So again, it's not scientific. It's
It's
just this.
not, it's not scientific. And
Okay.
look, when I'm making decisions on a campaign, I don't have the benefit of saying what are my buddies saying. And I don't mean to be dismissive.
No, no, no. That's why
You
I'm
have
bringing
to
it up to you.
you have to have a scientific rationale and hard evidence to make the decisions that you do. Sometimes your gut works. I'm not going to say that it doesn't. It does. It's like sports. It's like baseball. But sports aren't governed anymore by guts. I mean, that's why Moneyball was such a great movie. It's like that's not the way we do things anymore. You run things based off of evidence and off of science, and you make the best determinations that you can, knowing that there are still human variables like candidates who are going to fuck things up and say stupid
Yeah.
shit like, these people are eating pets and whatever that's going to change those dynamics. As long as people are involved, the human variable will make politics more of an art than a science. I believe that, but the science has become predominant. And I would suggest that every one of those people that may not say it would still vote the way that they did the last in 2020.
That they'd come back home wherever they
100%,
were. Yeah.
100%,
Yeah.
100%. And like I said, people in a negatively partisanized environment um, are not going to vote for Donald Trump. They may have these moments of going, wow, it looks really strong. And then by dinner, it's like, well, he's still Donald Trump. I mean,
Hmm.
and once they're reminded in a campaign environment, they're going to come back home, which is what a campaign is about. That's why you do them. So I'm not going to say that people don't change ideas or change positions. I think it's very, 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 very rare. But where they do, that can work both ways based off of the way you message your campaign. But the overwhelming characteristic of a campaign is defined by negative partisanship. And I know people feel totally different. And I think that's why they are convinced that this was the greatest move ever, is because they feel better. They feel different about the candidate. And that's fair. But in their heart of hearts, in the dark of night, when they're sitting there staring at the ceiling, would they change their vote? 99.99999% of these people would not. Then you get the question, well, would they even show up? Yes, they will absolutely show up because we are more defined by what we are voting against and standing against than by what we're voting for. It may feel good to feel joy, as we say, but there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that joy is confined largely to the Democratic base. Like I said, you can call it apples to oranges.
Yeah.
The weighting of the polling shows very clearly she is not doing as well as Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden at this point in the race. She's not. She's not.
So one other just quick pushback on this, and then we'll start to wind it down. But I can't imagine that at this stage of the game, Biden is doing another 15,000 seat arena every single day, the way Harris is doing it. And one of the things that you told me on our last conversation was that it wasn't just about college educated suburban women in Bucks County. It was also about Philadelphia and turnout in Philadelphia. So that's where I think seeing the evidence of as vigorous of a campaign as Harris is running and the enthusiasm or the vibes, I have to imagine at the very least that the turnout is going to be affected. So enthusiasm translates to maximizing turnout.
Might, but I would also say this: the size of your rally is not correlates to whether or not you win at all. It
Yeah.
never has. It's like a yard sign.
Okay.
You can look at those as indications of intensity, but RFK had intensity. The people voting for RFK on anti-vax behavior were extremely intense. They weren't going anywhere. It doesn't mean that it's broad-based. It
Yeah.
means that it's intense. Those are two different things.
You're depressing the shit out of me now,
No, I'm
Mike.
not. I shouldn't be because I'm agreeing with you. But what I'm saying is there's a strong tendency to take anecdotal evidence and say, this is why people are so shocked, because we so often live in the worlds that we create. And it is very hard as a political professional to separate that from the actual data and hard evidence and what we know from campaigns and we know from human behavior. And I'm not saying that Harris can't win a landslide. She could.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like that to a lot of people. She might. There's very little evidence to suggest that that is the case. Very little. There's more evidence to suggest that Trump is stronger than we think he is.
Yeah, I'm mentally preparing for that possibility. I think we all should. I mean, one of the reasons I think 2024 is different than 2016 is because most folks that had a vested interest in the race just assumed Hillary Clinton was going to win, not just win, but win big.
Yes.
Whereas I don't know anyone who is either involved in a campaign or is just an engaged citizen like me who thinks that way. So that's one of the fundamental ways where Harris and the entire campaign are going to sprint through the finish line on this. Whereas I don't think Hillary's campaign, she didn't show up in Michigan, she didn't show up in Wisconsin. So
I don't think that mattered.
okay. All right.
Rallies don't matter, brother. I mean, Mitt Romney was bringing in tons of people, bigger than Obama's in 2012, and this fight over rally size. It's kind of this weird Trump thing, which, by the way, I thought was a brilliant move in the debate. Like what took him off.
Oh yeah,
physical track was talking about his rallies, but every campaign pro is going like, "What the hell are you talking about?" Like, it's good for the media narrative, and that does work to a certain point, but if we were talking about the dominance of the media narrative and the joy that everybody's feeling, she should be up by 25 points.
She should be. Yes.
But she's not. And let's pay attention to that. Like, that means something.
Okay. So hopefully the Harris campaign's listening right now. They're taking your advice. What I'm definitely going to be taking from this conversation is an extra whiskey tonight. So thank you for that. So I'm not going to do the TP&R question the way we normally do it. I'm curious about something specific. Do you still have relationships with and have conversations with people who are fully in the MAGA world, like our buddy Joe Walsh does?
No.
Okay.
I don't want to, and I don't doubt, that Joe is talking to them every day. But to what end?
Yeah.
I do have friends that are voting for Trump, and I have learned to not talk about that with them.
So that's the approach is just to, talk about the Dodgers or just some other topic.
Yeah. And I have one particularly good close friend, and our friendship fell apart during the Trump era.
Mm-hmm.
We fixed it afterwards. But I don't know what will happen if Trump wins again. It'll be very difficult, but I see no reason to engage with the MAGA world. Like, I know, and you're doing God's work by trying to kind of, bring us together and start these conversations. I have zero interest in that.
Yeah.
I don't see the value in that. And I literally believe that most of this is demographics. And I'm going to be very crass in saying this. Most of that demographic is so old that the salvation of the republic is simply going to be Mother Nature doing what Mother Nature does.
Yeah, generation dying out, basically.
They just have to die and go away. They're very destructive to this country that has given them so much. And that is heartbreaking to me, but it's also angering. And like I said, I don't feel the need for reconciliation at this point. I don't need to make peace with these people. It's why the Republican Party will never be the same, in large part because those of us who were principled and stood up for what it actually claims to be have learned that the vast majority of them were never operating off of principle or
So it's funny.
ideology.
The way that I rewrote my typical TP&R question is, at a time like now for the next 6 weeks and beyond, how can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is now just not the time to even try to go there? And I think you answered my question already.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'll ask you a couple more things. Do you have any questions for me?
I'm just interested in the haircut, man, like how that all came about more than anything else. You look great. You look younger. You look stylish. You look hip.
Yeah.
Not that you didn't look good before, but it's a good
There's
look, man. It's a good, clean
I
look.
I could give you an easy, funny answer, which is and it is true that I got tired of having to take 20 minutes or 30 minutes every time I got in the
Very
damn shower.
practical. Very
Yeah.
practical.
But also I wanted to pretend to be respectable, at least for one more time in my life where it all started really going downhill.
The last
Um,
run.
the more serious one, though, and maybe we'll talk about this some other time, is there's been a process of I've battled mental illness my whole life,
Mhm.
and the last, I would say, 2-3 years, there have been moments. I've talked more about this with Jonathan Rausch and Pete Wayner, who've both become I'm really appreciative of their friendship. But it was an outgrowth, quite literally, of the darkness that I had been fighting. It was a tougher fight than I ever remember it being. Especially, it wasn't quite this time last year, but it went on for not just months but years, with some months being worse than others. But once I found equanimity within healthy ranges, there were other things physically that I could address. The weight that I've lost is more, much more impactful than my hair, but the hair was just another part of it. It was just, so that's maybe the more deeper answer than you were looking for.
No, well, first let me say I'm proud of you for being and talking openly about your mental health issues. I have not only dealt with that in my life too, with two particularly dark moments in my adult life, but I think it's important that we be open and talk about that and make sure that people realize that it's not uncommon. It is far more common, and it's better that we acknowledge it and reach out to each other. So I want you to know, brother, if you ever need to talk to me or call me, I'm here for you. You're not alone through all this. I would reach out to you in the same way because I know you're my friend. But I can also relate to sometimes you need those little changes. Sometimes just getting up out of bed and shaving and taking a shower and just feel like a new person. And that's just, that's a victory. That's a
Yeah.
victory. And just keep going forward. And I appreciate you.
Yeah, man. I appreciate that. It means more than you know. One of the things I've talked about is one of the arrows in my quiver of tools in my toolbox is literally somebody calling up and saying, "Hey, we're going out to lunch."
Yeah. It's so significant.
Yeah, it really means a ton.
Yeah.
So before we go, how can we follow you, find more information about the book, the Latino Century, the
Yeah.
Substack, and all the great work that you're doing?
Yeah, if you're interested in the stuff we've talked about, a lot of this I explore daily, a lot of content. I'm writing regularly and doing an analysis and my observations for whatever they're worth on Substack. The Great Transformation is my publication. Mike Madrid, you can find me there on Substack. My book is The Latino Century, that explores the demographic part of this change. And if you are in the Twitter or X world, you can find me at Madrid_Mike. You probably get too much Mike Madrid at a certain point, but regulate yourself the way that you'd like to. These are kind of the ideas that I explore very, very regularly.
I do not think there are any Mike Madrid overdoses. That's just not a thing.
Sure.
Mike, I love hanging out with you, man. I always
Yeah.
learn a ton. Especially when there's some disagreement, because it
Yeah.
challenges me, it pushes me, and then I inevitably learn something. So, really appreciate you, man.
Yeah, it's always good to be around people that you disagree with to learn. And I think that's the key is I think people that are intellectually curious like being wrong because you learn something.
Yeah.
And I like being wrong. That's why I think I surround myself with big brains, and that's why I like doing your show.
Oh man, that's awesome. Well, I always tell you, like, I see, you're dotting the globe and certainly the country with the book tour and everything. But if you happen to have a night or even an afternoon free in Valencia, California, Larson's on me, baby. Larson's
Let's
on
do
me.
it. Let's do it.
All right. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow the show, write the review, and now you can join the conversation on Patreon, patreon.com/politicsandreligion. Check it out, subscribe, do all the things. It's all very much appreciated and really, really helpful. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect. Have a great one.